couple minutes before we start, but while we're waiting, does anyone have any questions about anything we've covered up till now? We're all more or less clear on what a tractable discrete optimization problem is and what it means to formally pose a model. Okay, so I want to wait until the actual start time because people trickle in, but we'll be talking today about getting into intractable problems and how to recognize them and the things you can do with them. I'll give a heads up. So the first homework assignment will be going out Thursday. I'll put that on Blackboard, but also hand out hard copies in class. I do want to just reiterate what I said back in the first class, that I strongly recommend you don't wait until the last minute to try to do this. At a minimum, at least try to read through the assignment as soon as you get it, and I'd recommend starting well in advance. I don't think it's that hard, but I wouldn't expect to be able to finish it if you start the day before it's due. As I mentioned previously, I'm trying an experiment I haven't done with this class before, so recording the class. I put the first couple of lectures online. I'm curious if anyone actually finds these useful. I'd like to run through it for a term. Is anyone actually using these or thinks you might use them? Okay. I think we can pick up where we left off last time. And like I mentioned, today we'll be talking about hard or intractable problems, and in particular continuing our discussion of discrete optimization problems. So in computer science context, we often worry quite a bit about whether a problem is tractable or intractable, and very often there's a specific formal definition people use to determine whether a problem is tractable or intractable. And typically the way people define these is based on which problems have an algorithm that's polynomial time in the size of the input versus which ones that don't. We would often think of that in terms of complexity theory as a set of classes of problems. So all the things we saw in the previous class pretty much were examples of problems that have polynomial time algorithms. So things like maximum flow or minimum spanning tree. And these are generally denoted as the problem class P. So we would say that all of these problems are in a set of problems that's commonly referred to as P. And there are also other problems that are known not to have a polynomial time algorithm. So there is a broader class of problems known as X, and that it means that they require exponential time in the size of the problem. And there are some problems that are known to be in X, but not in P, so there are no polynomial time algorithms for them. For the most part, though, when we're talking about intractable problems, we're specifically interested in a class of problems that is kind of in between the ones we know to be hard and the ones we know not to be hard, and those are commonly referred to as the NP problems. And the NP problems are a set of problems that are not actually known not to have polynomial time algorithms for certain, but it's known that no one knows any polynomial time algorithms for any of these, and it's strongly suspected they're actually problems that can't be solved in polynomial time. So for our purposes, what we're going to do is assume that these NP problems are the intractable problems, or ones that don't have polynomial time algorithms. Now, I'm only giving a very brief introduction to what complexity theory is here. I know some of you have probably had complexity theory classes, some haven't. For our purposes, this is more or less the level at which you would need to know things. The main terminology I think we're going to need to be familiar with is you should know what P is. You should be familiar with the fact that NP is the set of problems containing P. And you should be familiar with a particular set of problems known as NP-complete problems, which in a formal theoretical sense are the hardest problems in NP. So if anything is NP-complete, that means it's as hard as anything in NP. And we also will sometimes refer to what are called the NP-hard problems. An NP-hard just means a problem that is at least as hard as an NP-complete problem. So anything that's NP-complete is also NP-hard. Anything in X is NP-hard, and so forth. So that's just some terminology. And as I say, we'll usually, in formal context, think of the problems that are in P as the tractable problems, and the problems not in P as the intractable problems. Now, it is worth knowing, as I mentioned last time, that in real-world practice, things aren't quite so clean-cut. So if you're talking about problems in analyzing genomic sequence data, you might have gigabases or terabases of data in a particular data set, and even something that's in P may not really be tractable in practice. You can't really run an n-cubed algorithm on a terabase of sequence data, at least with our current resources. So often we'll have some more vague definitions when we talk about things in the real world, and I'll get to that more towards the end of the lecture. But I want to talk a bit about what these problems are and some examples of them, so that you'll be familiar with some of the common kinds of NP-hard problems, and that we'll have some common problems that everyone is aware of that we can use in analyzing modeling issues with respect to hard problems. So there are a few reasons why I think this is an important thing to cover in this class. One of these is that it's important to know when you're developing models when to revise the model. So sometimes we pose a model and we want to be able to recognize that the model we've posed corresponds to a hard problem that's not likely to have an efficient algorithm because of that. And often in those cases, we might go back to the model and see if we can revise it and come up with a different model that is maybe more tractable computationally. We would also often want to know when to stop looking for efficient algorithms. There are going to be cases where we actually do want to work with an intractable problem. It may be that to capture the essential biology of the system, we really do need to pose it as a model that ends up being NP-hard. That's actually a very common thing in practice. But in those cases, you don't want to just keep looking for an algorithm, trying to figure out if maybe there's something you missed that will solve it. If you can show that your problem is in fact NP-complete or NP-hard, then that tells you that you can be pretty sure you're never going to find a tractable algorithm, so you have to look at other kinds of approaches to it. And that's really the third reason I want to bring these up, that you need to know when to look at a different set of tools. And that's one of the things I'll get to around the end of this lecture. We might end up having to cover at the beginning of next lecture. But intractable in practice doesn't really mean hopeless. There's actually a lot we can do with intractable problems. And we'll go through some of the methods you can use there. But you do at least need to know that you're looking at one of those problems to know that you don't want to be looking at developing a tractable algorithm. You need to work at these other sorts of tools. The last point is kind of a specialized one, and that is that we need to know about some of these problems as a toolkit for what are called reductions. And reductions is another thing I'll get to towards the end of the lecture. Basically, the way we recognize that problems are hard is by figuring out ways of reducing problems we know are hard into the problems we're not sure about. Essentially transforming them. That's usually how you prove a problem is hard, and you have to know a set of hard problems if you want to get started with that. So that is more or less why we're going to be looking at hard problems today. So are there any questions about any of this? By a show of hands, how many of you are already familiar with, let's say, the term NP-complete? Okay, so maybe half. So I think this is an important thing to be aware of in practice if you're going to work in modeling contexts, because it's very often going to end up that the natural sorts of models you pose will end up being NP-complete or NP-hard problems. You should be aware of some of the issues that come up in dealing with them. So just like with the last class, what I wanted to do is start by talking about some examples of hard problems that we're all aware of, some common hard problems that we can discuss. And I actually mentioned one intractable problem at the end of last lecture. Does anyone remember what that was? Well, I mentioned something called a Steiner tree problem. And the Steiner tree problem came up as a model of intraspecies phylogenetics. And in that context, I had said that we would imagine we have some set of species, like let's say a set of genetic sequences. We're trying to build an evolutionary tree connecting them. If we allow for the introduction of other unseen sequences, so maybe we'd say that we've got a sequence AA and a sequence CC and a sequence AC, maybe we think that it might be that the most plausible explanation is that for whatever reason CA was in between here, and then that transformed into, say, CC, and then that transformed into AC. That would be an example of a Steiner tree inference where we're given certain sequences, and we have to infer that there may be others that are involved in building the tree. The way we posed the problem last time is not quite the standard way. You'll usually see the Steiner tree problem phrased. And I just want to put it down in a formal statement of the more general Steiner tree problem. It consists of an input, which is going to be a graph. So it's going to have a vertex set and an edge set. We would commonly assume that this is an undirected graph, but it's a weighted graph. So we'll have a mapping from the edges to the real numbers. That's our weight function. And in the most common way this is posed, we will have a set of vertices, so a subset of the vertex set S that are known as the terminal vertices. And the terminal vertices are going to be the ones we assume have to be in the tree we're trying to find. And then we'll say that the other ones are ones that may or may not be in the tree, so everything in B minus S. Now, one point I need to make in describing these is that canonically an intractable problem, when we make a formal statement, is phrased as what's called a decision problem rather than an optimization problem. And decision problem just means that we try to phrase these as answering a yes-no question rather than optimizing. So we don't generally have an objective function, we just have a question we're trying to ask. But usually these problems have an equivalent optimization problem. And I'll illustrate what I mean in a second. So in the decision version of this, we would say that we're also given as input a bound B chosen from the real numbers. And then the question we would ask is the following. Does there exist a tree T where the tree is subset B prime of the vertices and E prime of the edges of our original sequence, of our original tree, such that S is a subset of B prime, which is a subset of B, and such that sum over the edges E prime of the weight of the edge is less than or equal to B. And I guess I should also say here E prime subset E. So what this is asking is there a tree on our original graph that includes all the vertices in S and optionally other vertices from V, such that the weight of the tree is smaller than the bound? Can anyone think of how we might rephrase that question as an optimization? What would be the optimization this is kind of getting at? Yeah.
What's the lowest cost tree?
Yeah. So the optimization version, we would just get rid of the bound here. Instead of asking whether this was smaller than the bound, we would just say that the objective is to minimize the cost of this. So that would be the equivalent optimization problem. But usually, as I say, we phrase these as these decision problems, as asking the question. But whenever you see a decision problem with one of these bounds, it's relatively easy to transform back and forth. If you can minimize this, it's easy to figure out whether the minimum is smaller than the bound. And it's a little more complicated to go the other way, but if you have something that can answer the question, you can do, let's say, just a search on possible values of the bound to find the minimum value of the bound. So any questions about that? Right, so this, as I said, is not quite the way we saw the problem phrased. In the previous class, we had assumed that the vertices we were given were binary sequences, let's say genetic sequences, and the terminals where the genetic sequences were given, and then we kind of implicitly had that all of the other ones were any sequences we weren't given. In this case, we're explicitly saying that we're given some set of vertices, and then there's another set of vertices, a larger one, that includes the extra nodes that can be thrown in, what are called the Steiner nodes. So that's one example of an NP-hard problem, and that's one that I think is particularly useful for us to know because Steiner tree problems are a model for various problems in actual phylogenetics work. So if you're trying to solve hard phylogenetic problems, often a Steiner tree problem is a good model of what you're really trying to do. But there are quite a few others, and I'll just continue by talking about some other examples of graph problems, because just like with the tractable problems, there are quite a few intractable graph problems. So one of the best known of these is something that's commonly called the traveling salesman problem, or the TSP problem. And in this problem, we would have as our input a directed graph, no vertex set and a directed edge set. We're going to assume that we've got n vertices. Let's say the vertices are v1 through vn. We're going to have a weight function. This will be v cross v to r. And we're going to have a bound. So v in the real numbers. And our question here is going to be, does there exist a permutation pi 1 up through pi n of v1 through vn? So in other words, is there a rearrangement of the vertices in the graph, a reordering of them, such that the weight of the edge from pi n to pi 1 plus the sum of the weights I equals 1 to n minus 1 of pi I to pi I plus 1 less than or equal to v. So can anyone say in plain English what this is asking?
So if you imagine a traveling salesman, he wants to visit, like, if you consider the nodes as cities, for example, he wants to visit all of them and also travel the least distance to do so.
Yeah, so we might imagine in a simple version, maybe we've got just a simple graph like this. We've got some directed edges. We can imagine there are weights attached to these edges. Maybe it's got a weight of 1, that's 4, that's 2, that's 3, that's 5, that's 1. We might be asking, is there a path we can take to walk around all of these vertices that has distance less than whatever bound we're given? So if we're given a bound of 6, is there a path that visits all of the vertices and returns to the start that has weight less than 6? In this case, we could say there is. There's a path that goes from here to here to here that has weight 5. And in the optimization version, we would just ask, what is the minimum length or minimum weight path along the vertices? So this is something that comes up in quite a lot of different contexts. We'll actually see that maybe surprisingly this is a model of a problem in sequence assembly. So the problem of creating a long DNA sequence from short reads of that sequence. But it's just in general one of the common problems that always comes up in these kinds of cases. It has some other less obvious uses. So for example, there's an interesting use in visualization. If you've got a set of, let's say, gene expression data, commonly represented as a matrix, where we've got order the samples to maximize contiguity between adjacent samples. That's something you can pose as a traveling salesman problem, so trying to minimize the amount of deviation between sensitive samples. So it comes up in a lot of these sorts of disguised contexts. So any questions about that? So this problem is related to another graph problem. This one actually doesn't quite have a straightforward optimization version, but it's another good one to be aware of, and we'll also see this in some context related to genetic sequencing. And that's something known as the Hamiltonian path problem. So the Hamiltonian path problem is also a problem that has to do with walks or tours among the vertices of a graph. And the question in the Hamiltonian path problem, in this case, working with an unweighted graph, is going to be, does there exist a permutation pi of the vertices, so pi 1 through pi n, such that pi I plus 1 is in the edge set for all I equals 1, n minus 1. So in this case, as I said, we're assuming an unweighted graph. We've got a g equals b comma e. And here, we're not going to assume necessarily that every edge is in the graph. So we might have a set of vertices. Let's say these are our vertices in the graph and a set of edges. And what this is asking basically is there any path in this directed graph that lets us visit every vertex exactly once without repeating any of the vertices? So can we get to every vertex and not repeat any of them? In this case, we could do that by taking this edge, then this edge, then this edge, then this edge. That would visit all the vertices without any repeats. So this graph has a Hamiltonian path. A graph may or may not have a Hamiltonian path, and figuring out whether or not it does is an example of an intractable problem. Any questions about that? And so one of the useful things to know about intractable and tractable problems that comes up in looking at these graph problems is that often what seem like relatively subtle changes to the definition of a problem can make the difference between whether it's tractable or intractable. And that comes up in looking at some problems that are related to something we saw last time, and that is a set of what are called cut problems. So last time we saw one cut problem. Does anyone remember what that was? Yeah, we'd seen the min-cut problem. So the min-cut problem, we're assuming we have a graph. It is a weighted graph, and we're trying to figure out what is the smallest cut, so the smallest weight of edges we would need to remove to separate two particular nodes in the graph. So that was the min-cut problem. And as we saw last time, that's a tractable problem. There is also what's called the max-cut problem, and max-cut is an intractable problem. So max-cut is not exactly the opposite of min-cut, although it's a related problem. Max-cut looks as follows. In max-cut, we would generally assume we have an undirected graph, although it doesn't have to be. G equals b comma e. We'll assume we have a weight function, let's say b cross b r, and we'll assume in the decision version that we've got a bound. And the question we're trying to ask with respect to max-cut is, does there exist, let's say, a subset of the vertices V1 such that the sum over vertices V, little v1 and big V1, and little v2 in V minus big V1 of the weight of V1 comma V2 is greater than or equal to B. So what this is asking, in other words, is if we create our graph, and let's say we took this graph and we just imagine sets of weights on the edges of that graph, what this is asking is there any way to split the vertices into two sets such that the sum of the weights of the edges between those two sets is above some bound. Or in the optimization version, what is the way of splitting the nodes into two sets that maximizes the weight of edges between the two sets? So is that clear to everyone? Okay, so this is a model of a problem that comes up quite often in well, systems biology kinds of contexts in a lot of different versions. Can anyone think of what problem you might perform that might be represented as a maximum cut problem? Yeah.
Regulation networks define like the path which proteins are most likely to be involved in, for instance.
Well, it is related to various network problems. So often in a network or in pretty much any kind of large, complicated data set, we're often interested in discovering clusters in the data. And there's the common problem of clustering, trying to take a set of data and figure out if there are meaningful subsets in the data. So if you imagine that maybe we're looking at people who have some disease and we're trying to figure out, do they fall into different subcategories of people who might respond to different treatments? You could try profiling those people based on their blood levels, some metabolites, try plotting them in a space based on those values, get a set of points in that space, and you might be interested in figuring out that there are some people who fall in one kind of cloud here, some in another. If you come up with some natural measure of distance between the different people in that space, then you can represent that as a maximum cut problem. So trying to find the way of grouping these into two sets such that you maximize the amount of distance that's separating the sets. Does that make sense to everyone? All right, so maximum cut, as I've said, is a hard problem, even though minimum cut is not a hard problem. And in fact, there are a number of variations on this. There's what's called the maximum k-cut. So maximum k-cut means that instead of splitting this into two sets, we split it into k-sets. So you can have a maximum 3-cut, where you're trying to take your graph and split it into 3 subsets of vertices so as to maximize the weight between them, or max 4-cut or whatever. And you can also have a minimum k-cut. And it turns out that even though minimum 2-cut is tractable, it's more or less equivalent to the problem we saw last time, minimum 3-cut is intractable. So basically, max or minimum k-cut for any k greater than 2 is intractable, maximum k-cut for k even 2 is intractable, but minimum 2-cut is tractable. So that's not such an uncommon thing in these kinds of problems. And that's what I mean when I say that small variations can make a big difference in the tractability of a problem. So any questions about that? And so there are a few other problems I wanted to introduce because they are fairly simple problems. They're closely related to one another. And they end up coming up pretty often when you're trying to figure out what problem some real-world system reminds you of. They're useful quite a bit for the reductions I mentioned, so I think they're just good problems to be aware of. And one of these is a problem known as the vertex cover problem. I'm not going to bother writing the formal statements of all of these. I think these are simple enough that you can kind of get them visually. And if I put down a simple graph here, I can show you what a vertex cover is. So a vertex cover is a set of vertices, and it's in particular a set of vertices such that every edge in the graph has at least one endpoint in the vertex cover. That's what makes it a vertex cover. So in this graph here, we have 6 vertices, and we can get a vertex cover of this graph by taking this vertex, which covers these 3 edges. We can throw in this vertex, which covers these 3 edges, and then throw in this vertex, which covers the remaining edges. So that would be a vertex cover of this graph. And in the normal version of this, the optimization version, what we're trying to do is find a minimum vertex cover. So we want to find a small number of vertices that cover the entire graph. So does the problem statement make sense to everyone? And so this is closely related to another simple problem that comes up quite a lot. It's known as the independent set problem. And the independent set problem says, given a graph, we want to find a set of vertices such that no 2 vertices in the set share an edge. So in this graph, for example, we can say that if we pick that vertex alone is an independent set. If you just have one vertex, that's always an independent set. We could throw in this vertex, and those two collectively are an independent set. And we could throw in this vertex, and those three collectively are an independent set. So there's no edge that joins any two of those three vertices. Now you might notice here that when I put the independent set on top of the vertex cover here, the independent set is exactly the nodes that aren't in the vertex cover, and that's going to be true in general. So if you have a vertex cover of a graph, the nodes not in the vertex cover constitute an independent set, and vice versa. If you have an independent set, the nodes not in the independent set constitute a vertex cover. So those are really equivalent problems to one another, what are called duals of one another. So that might give you a hint that if we're trying to find small vertex covers, then generally what we would try to find are large independent sets. So the optimization version of independent set would be to find as large an independent set as you can in a graph, and that is another hard problem. So the connection between those two is not so hard to see. If you've got a vertex cover, then that means you've covered at least one endpoint of each edge, so the vertices left out of it have to be an independent set, because you can't have both endpoints of any edge left in the remaining vertices. And in the opposite direction, if you have an independent set, you haven't covered both endpoints of any edge, so what's left has to be a vertex cover. There's a third problem that is actually also sort of equivalent to these, or closely related, where the connection's not quite so obvious, and that's known as the maximum clique problem. So the maximum clique problem is defined on a graph, typically an undirected, unweighted graph. And let me just draw another graph here that we can use to illustrate that. So a clique is simply a fully connected subgraph of a graph. So if we have two vertices with an edge between them, that's a clique, or more specifically a two-clique. If we have a triangle in the graph, that's a clique, and in this case a three-clique, so three nodes that have all possible edges between them. And if we have a tetrahedron like this, then that is a four-clique. So we've got four nodes, and any pair of them have edges between them. In this case, the four-clique is the maximum clique in the graph. It's the largest clique here. And in the max clique problem, what we would be asking in the decision version is there a clique of size at least b? And in the optimization version, just what is the largest clique in the graph? So is the problem statement clear to everyone? Right, so this is also a simplified version of something we would often encounter in biological contexts. So in this case, if we're working with network models like reaction networks or protein-protein interaction networks, a clique would often correspond to what you might think of as a set of proteins that form a complex, or in a regulatory network, a set of co-regulated genes. It's oversimplifying a bit because things are always a bit messy in the real world practice, but it's at least a starting point for thinking of these problems of finding modules of co-acting genes or other elements in complicated networks. Now I mentioned that this is related to these other two problems, and the transformation is not quite so obvious as the transformation between vertex cover and independent set. If you want to see how max clique is related to these, you have to think about what is called the complement graph. So the transformation from the graph G to its complement, what we can call G bar. And all the complement graph is the graph with the same nodes as G, but the opposite edges. So any pair of nodes that have an edge between them in G don't in G bar, and vice versa. And if you do that transformation, then a max clique in G turns into an independent set in G bar, and vice versa. So that's the relationship between those two problems. If you can find maximal cliques in G, then you can find maximal independent sets in G bar, or vice versa. Does that make sense to everyone? Right, any questions about anything up till this point? And so another problem that's often useful to know about in these graph contexts is what's called graph coloring, or K-coloring. So in a graph coloring problem, we will be given a graph. In this case, it would typically be an undirected, unweighted graph. And the goal of a coloring is to label the vertices of the graph so that no two vertices that share an edge have the same label. And in the optimization version of this, what we're trying to do is label the graph with as few labels as possible. So we might say that this vertex gets label 1, and then to have a proper coloring, we have to label this one with some label other than 1, because they share an edge. So maybe we'll call that vertex label 2. And then we have to give this vertex a label that is neither 1 or 2, because it's adjacent to both of those. So we can call that label 3. We can look at this one, and we can see that that can't have label 2 or label 3, but it actually can have label 1 again. And then this one can't have 1 or 2, but it can have 3. So this is referred to as a 3 coloring of the graph, because we can color all the vertices with 3 colors. Now in the optimization version, we try to find the minimum number of colors. That's referred to as the chromatic number of the graph. And graph coloring is one of those problems that has a special case that's tractable, but in the general case is intractable. So in particular, it's easy to figure out if a graph is two colorable. So if you want to ask, is it possible to color your graph in 2 colors, that's tractable. But to ask if you want to color your graph in 3 colors or anything bigger than 2, that's intractable. So does anyone know what we call a graph that is 2 colorable? Yeah.
Bipartite graph?
Yeah, so we saw those in the previous lecture. Bipartite graphs is another name for a 2 colorable graph. That means we've got 2 sets of vertices such that all of the edges are passing between the 2 sets, never within them, and then you can just color one set 1 and one set 2, so that's a 2 colorable graph. So bipartite just means 2 colorable. Right, so graph coloring is another one of those problems that's often a good model for just random problems that you're not sure about. And it tends to come up a lot in what you can think of as resource allocation problems. So you've got some finite resource, you're trying to allocate that to a set of jobs or tasks or whatever, and you have constraints that certain kinds of things can't be handled at the same time. So maybe you are trying to allocate compute jobs on a parallel processor, and you've got certain pairs of jobs that can't be run simultaneously. Then the problem of figuring out how many rounds of computing you need becomes a graph coloring job. So you try to put all the ones that can be handled simultaneously on at once, and then when those are done, you handle other ones that couldn't be handled with those, and so forth. And then the coloring of the graph of these constraints becomes the number of rounds you need. Any questions about that? Okay, so one of the things I'll be asking you to do on the homework assignment is to look at problems like this and to take descriptions of kind of plain English, real-world descriptions of problems you might encounter in biology and try to think of how you might use problems like this, either tractable or intractable, as models of those. So I think it's good to kind of think about these as abstractions, and when I discuss real-world problems, think about how you might abstract them as a graph or a set of strings or whatever, and what kinds of problems that suggests to you. So there's one other graph problem, or really family of graph problems I wanted to mention, and that is something known as the maximum subgraph, or there's a closely related thing called the maximum induced subgraph with property pi. So I mention this because it's actually not a single problem. It's a very large family of problems that covers quite a lot of things you might want to optimize within a graph. And to understand this, you need to know what property pi is. So property pi isn't a specific thing. It's any property of a graph that satisfies two conditions. And one of those conditions is that a number of graphs have satisfied the property pi, and an infinite number don't satisfy. And the other condition is that the property is what's called inheritable, which means if G satisfies pi, any subgraph of G satisfies pi. And in the induced subgraph version, any induced subgraph. So to explain what that means, a subgraph simply means if you take a graph and you pull out some of the edges, what you're left with is a subgraph. An induced subgraph means you take a graph, pull out some of the nodes and all of the edges connected to those nodes, then that's an induced subgraph. And there are a lot of different properties pi that we can come up with that will satisfy these conditions. So a simple example of that would be the property of bipartiteness. So we can come up with an infinite number of graphs that satisfy bipartiteness. So if we start with, let's say, 2 vertices, and then we just keep adding more vertices like this, what we end up with is an infinite family of graphs that are all bipartite. So this is one part, this is the other. We can extend this for as many nodes as we want. So an infinite number of graphs satisfy bipartiteness. And we can just as easily make an infinite number that don't satisfy it. So we can just start with a triangle. A triangle is not bipartite. And then just keep adding vertices onto that triangle. And we get an infinite family of graphs that are not bipartite. So bipartiteness is a non-trivial property. And it's also an inheritable property. If you have a graph that's bipartite and you pull out any edges, you still have a bipartite graph. If you pull out any nodes, you still have a bipartite graph. So that tells us that bipartiteness works as a property pi here, and knowing that we have a property that meets these conditions tells us that it is intractable to take any graph and find the largest subgraph that is bipartite. And that works for a lot of other kinds of graph properties you can come up with. So another example is what's called planarity. So planarity of a graph basically just means you can write it on a two-dimensional surface without any edges crossing one another. It's intractable to figure out or identify the largest planar subgraph of any graph because planarity also satisfies the non-triviality and inheritability conditions. Does that make sense to everyone?
So it would be reasonable to say that a non-bipartiteness graph would not be property pi?
Well, non-bipartiteness doesn't fit these conditions because it's not inheritable. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I'm not actually sure if, well, I guess it may not be a meaningful question of the largest non-bipartite subgraph since either the graph's bipartite or it isn't. But yeah, and that would be something that doesn't satisfy the conditions. Are there any other questions? Okay, so that's an example of a set of graph problems. And we also can consider various other kinds of problems. So just like last time we saw sets of string and sequence problems, and just as we saw a bunch of tractable string and sequence problems, I want to introduce some intractable string and sequence problems. So one intractable problem I can mention is the longest common subsequence problem. And longest common subsequence problem will state as follows. As input, you have a set of sequences, W1, W2, up through some WK, and we'll assume we have a bound. In this case, the bound will be a positive integer, C+, and our question is going to be the following. Does there exist an S that is a subsequence of each of our input sequences such that the length of S is at least B. So in other words, if we had, let's say, the sequences GC, GCA, CG, ATA, AC, G, AAA, we could line these up to find a longest common subsequence as follows. We could say GC, GCA, line up CG, ATA, line up here A, CG, AA. Let's do it this way. AA. And we could see that the longest subsequence we can get that's in all of them would consist of these characters. So remember, a subsequence does not have to be consecutive. It has to be in order, but not consecutive in the sequences. So the string CGA is a subsequence of each of these. There's CGA here, CGA here, CGA here. So everyone follow that? So I've asserted that this is a hard problem. But if you remember last class carefully, you might remember that I told you about something called the longest common subsequence problem last class, and I told you it was a tractable problem. So what's the difference?
Yeah, the third string.
Yeah. So this is an example of a problem that is tractable if you have two strings. And it's actually tractable if you have 3 strings or 4 strings or any fixed number of strings. But it's intractable if you treat the number of strings as a variable. So it's exponential runtime in the number of input sequences. But for any fixed number of input sequences, it's polynomial, but polynomial with an exponential in the number of sequences. So that's sometimes referred to as a fixed parameter tractable problem. So if you fix it to a certain maximum number of sequences, then you can say it's polynomial, but in general, we would think of this as an exponential time problem. So that's another one of those things that you'll commonly see with these NP-hard problems. Sometimes there's a parameter, and if you just fix that parameter to a constant, it's tractable for any constant value of that parameter, even though if you allow it to float freely, you would say it's formally an exponential, or an NP-hard problem. And so this, like the two-sequence version I told you before, is a model of the sequence alignment problem. In this case, we can think of this as a model of multiple sequence alignments, the problem of aligning a set of sequences together. Because it's intractable, it's not necessarily so helpful for solving the problem in practice for larger numbers of sequences, but it's at least a way we can get started on modeling it. Now this problem is hard. You may remember that there was an intractable, tractable longest common substring problem last time. So the longest common substring was to find the longest sequence that is contiguous. So the longest substring meaning that the characters have to be consecutive in each of the input sequences. So longest common substring is actually tractable no matter how many sequences you give it. So whereas longest common subsequence, the runtime blows up exponentially in the number of input sequences, you can basically use the same linear time algorithm I told you about last time to solve longest common substring on an arbitrary number of strings. There are also some related problems involving shortest superstrings or supersequences. So there is what is called the shortest common superstring problem. And the shortest common superstring problem says that we're given a set of strings and we want to find the shortest string we can such that each of our input strings is a substring of it. And you can kind of visualize that by imagining that we're given a set of input strings, and I'll just line them up in a particular way. So let's say that these were our input strings, ACGGA, GGACT, ACTCCA, and CAGG. In this case, an example of a superstring would be ACGG, ACT, CCAGG. So each of our input strings is a substring of this one, and this, I believe, ends up being the shortest common superstring. So it's the shortest string such that each of our inputs is contained within it. That is an intractable problem. So longest common substring is tractable, shortest common superstring is intractable. This ends up being a very nice model of an important problem in biology I mentioned previously, the sequence assembly problem. So it is an important issue that we'll need to consider, and once we look at that next time, that this is an intractable problem, but is something we need to solve, or at least we need to solve something closely related to it quite a bit in modern genomic technologies. There is also a shortest common supersequence problem. The shortest common supersequence problem is basically the same thing, except that we are looking for a shortest string such that each of our inputs is a subsequence of it. So if we imagine we had an input, and I'll just write these spaced out a bit, say GC, GCA, and CG, ATA, and ACG, AA. Then we could say that the shortest common supersequence of these would be GA, CG, CA, TAA. So each of our input sequences here is going to be a subsequence of this, so this would be a supersequence of the inputs. Now, it's not so hard to see when I've drawn these with the spaces in the right places, but if you don't know where to put the spaces, it's an intractable problem to figure out the shortest common supersequence. Any questions about that? Okay, so I also wanted to introduce a couple of examples of one more class of hard problems, and that is the set of set problems. So set problems, that is problems referring to sets, are a kind of problem that you can often think of as a more general version of graph problems. So they're often useful for reductions. They often come up, they really come up in quite a lot of contexts because they're a more general version of things you can typically do with graphs. And I'll show you one example of this called the minimum test set problem. So this one, the statement of the problem is a little confusing. I'll write the formal statement, but I think an example makes it very clear. The minimum test set problem has as input a set S, which contains a set of elements S1 through Sn, and a collection C of subsets of S. So we'll say that's C1 through Cm, where each of these CIs is a subset of the set S, and we'll assume that there is a bound. In this case, it will be an integer bound. And the question we'll want to ask here is the following. Does there exist a C prime subset of C, so a subset of the collections, such that for all Si and Sj in S, so for any pair of elements in our original set S, there exists a C in C prime such that the set Si, Sj intersected with the set C has size 1, and such that C prime is less than or equal to P. So that's kind of a confusing way of stating things. But what this is really saying is there a subset of our collection, so a set of these CIs, such that for any pair of S's, we can find some set that contains just one of them. And the example that I think gives a nice motivation for this is to imagine that we've got a set of organisms, let's say a set of strains of bacteria, and we're trying to figure out how to identify our strains. So maybe we've got a strain 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we try sequencing their DNA in a little region, and we end up getting at various consecutive sites of DNA, that maybe this one has the sequence ATACC, and this one has CTGTC, and this one is maybe CGGTG, and this one is ATGTG, and this one is CGGCC. What we're trying to ask here is there a small number of sets of sites we can look at to uniquely identify what strain we're looking at? So we can see, for example, that if you just look at the first site, you can't tell whether you're, like let's say the first site is A, you don't know for certain whether you're looking at strain 1 or strain 4. But if you see that the first site is A and the third site is A, then you know you're looking at strain 1. So to be able to unambiguously separate all of the strains, we could look at, let's say, sites 1 and 2 and site 4. And if we check carefully, we can verify that just by looking at those 3 sites, we can uniquely identify each of those 5 strains. So that would tell us that we can create a minimum test set by looking at these 3 sites. And that would be an example of a minimum test set problem. And to see what that has to do with this formal statement here, you can just think of the strains as the set. So our set S is the set of different strains, and then each of these sites defines a subset. So we can say that site 1, for example, defines the subset 2, 3, 5, because one of the alleles contains 2, 3, and 5, and then that gives us a way of uniquely distinguishing strains 2, 3, and 5 from strains 1 and 4. This site, we can say, defines the subset 1, 2, 4, because if you see a T there, you know it's 1, 2, or 4. If you see a G, you know it's 3 or 5, and so forth. So does that make sense to everyone? Right, so there is another set problem I'll just mention that has a statement that looks very similar to this, but it's actually a subtly different but also very interesting problem. And that is called the minimum set cover problem. And as the name implies, this is sort of a generalization of the vertex cover problem to handle more arbitrary kinds of subsets than you see in the graph. So the minimum set cover problem, our input is going to look a lot like in the minimum test set. We've got a set S, a collection of subsets of S, C, a bound B. I'm not writing all the details down here. And the question we want to ask is, does there exist a C prime subset of C, so a subset of elements of the collection, such that for any S in S, there exists a little c in C prime, such that S is in little c, and such that the size of C prime is less than or equal to B. And this also may be a little unclear just from the definition, but I think an example makes clear what we're trying to do here. So imagine you are a doctor in a clinic and you've got a patient who has, let's say, pneumonia. And you're trying to find a drug to treat that, but you know the patient might have any of several different strains of bacteria causing their pneumonia, and each responds to different drugs. So maybe we've got 5 different kinds of bacteria that might be affecting the patient, and we've got a set of antibiotics to choose from, so maybe 4 different antibiotics, and each of those affects only a subset of the bacteria. So antibiotic 1 maybe will kill bacteria 1, 3, or 4. Antibiotic 2 will kill 1, 2, or 3. 3 will kill 2, 3, or 4. 4 will kill 1, 3, or 5. And the question we want to ask is there a minimum set of antibiotics we can give to be sure that we'll kill whatever strain is present? So in this case, we could say that if we give the patient antibiotics 3 and 4, then one of those 2 is going to kill the bacterium, whichever of those 5 strains it is. So that would be the minimum test set. Here, the collections would consist of 1 collection per antibiotic, whose members are the strains of bacterium that are killed by that antibiotic. So S would be the 5 bacteria, collection 1 would be bacteria 1, 3, and 4, and so forth. Any questions about that? Okay, So that is just a set of problems, and just like with the tractable problems, it's very far from an exhaustive set. So there are probably thousands, maybe tens of thousands of things that people have shown are NP-complete problems, and I put some references in the text if you want to know more about these. Time to time to just look up libraries of problems. So if you're trying to figure out whether something you're looking at is a known hard problem, there are websites or texts or whatever that you can go to look up hundreds or thousands of problems people have shown are hard, and maybe see if someone's worked on your problem or something similar to it. One of the big reasons for doing that, though, is that very often you'll find that no one has worked on exactly your problem, but they've worked on similar things. And that's where we come to the issue that I mentioned back at the beginning of the class of reductions. So how do you figure out that a new problem is hard? So this is something that always confuses people. I think it's important to kind of try to get your head around this. What you would generally try to do to show a problem is hard is start with a problem that you know is hard. So let's say we've got a problem A, and this one we don't know is hard. So we have no idea whether A is hard or not. What we try to do is take a problem B that we know is hard, and then we try to do the following. We take our problem B, and we do what's called a polynomial reduction to turn problem B into problem A. So in other words, what we do is take some input that is the problem B that that we know is hard, and we transform that into an instance of problem A. And we have to be able to do this for every instance of problem B, and we have to be able to do it in polynomial time in the size of the problem. So that then is called a polynomial reduction, and then what we will declare is that we will use what's called an oracle, so kind of hypothetical solver for A. So we'll pretend that there's something that solves A in polynomial time, and that will give us the solution to our problem A, so let's call that A star. And then what we do is use the fact that we turned our problem B into a problem A to produce the solution B star to our original problem B. Now this is just a thought experiment. And the reason it's a thought experiment is that if B was actually hard, then you can't do this. So if B was actually a hard problem, which is what we're assuming, then something has to go wrong in this process here. And if we've done the reduction right, then what has to be wrong is that the oracle can't exist. So there can't be a way of solving problem A efficiently. So by doing this reduction, what we've really done is prove that if there's no efficient algorithm to solve B, then there can't be an efficient algorithm to solve A. So that's usually how you would prove A is hard. And I'm going through this slowly because people usually have trouble with this in the sense of usually when people do this wrong, they'll try to do it in reverse. So they'll try to say, I've got a problem A, I don't know it's hard. I've got a problem B that I do know is hard. I'll turn problem A into problem B, and that proves that problem A is hard. And that doesn't work. So it's actually not so hard to take an easy problem and turn it into a hard problem. That's pretty trivial to do. So you can't go in the opposite direction. That doesn't prove anything. You have to go from the problem you know is hard to the one you're not sure about, and that proves that the one you're not sure about is hard. That make sense to everyone? And so to illustrate with a couple of problems we've seen before, let's imagine that we didn't know if the max clique problem was hard or not. So the max clique problem, remember, is the problem of taking a graph, let's call the graph G equals VE, and figuring out the size of the largest clique, or whether it has a clique of at least some given size. Let's say we don't know that that problem is hard. What we want to do is find a problem we know is hard that we can turn into the max clique problem. So what might be a good guess for that known hard problem that we could use? Yes, the independent set problem is a problem I've told you is hard. So if we have an independent set problem, then we can say that we start with our independent set. We know that that is a hard problem. And what we're going to want to do then is take an instance of the independent set. Let's maybe call that G star. So that's B star, comma E star. So we've got our independent set. And then what we're going to try to do is prove max clique is hard by transforming independent set to max clique. So as I mentioned before, we can take an independent set problem and we can transform that to the complement graph. Let's say G star bar. So that would be same vertex set, flip the edges. And then we know that the maximum independent set in our original graph is going to correspond to a maximum clique in this graph. So if max clique were not hard, then what we could do is run our max clique algorithm on this transformed problem, and we know that the answer it gives will be the solution to our original independent set problem. Since independent set is hard, we know that can't work, and that's telling us that there can't be an efficient algorithm to solve maximum clique. So that's a proof that maximum clique is a hard problem. So everyone follow that? Yeah.
Explain that again.
All right, so we want to prove that maximum clique is hard. We're assuming we don't know that, but I'm assuming we do know that independent set is hard. So what we do is say that we take an arbitrary input to the independent set problem, and then by flipping it into the complement graph, we know that a solution to the maximum clique problem in this graph is a solution to the independent set problem in this graph. So we propose hypothetically that max clique wasn't hard. We run our max clique algorithm on this, and that gives us a solution to our independent set problem, and that's a contradiction. So if independent set, if we could do that, we'd have an efficient algorithm to solve independent set. Since we're assuming no such algorithm exists, that's proving there can't be an efficient algorithm for maximum clique. Does that answer
Why?
it?
It is a reduction. I mean, not making the problem more easier to solve.
Yeah, I'm not sure why the term reduction is used. The transformation might be a better term, but reduction is the term people use. I don't know why that is. Any other questions? Okay, so that is one of the reasons that I think it's important to just kind of know a collection of problems. And as I say, if you're trying to show a problem is hard, then it often helps to know a set of existing hard problems. And you might go to one of these compendiums of problems that I mentioned in the textbook to look up problems that might be similar to the one you're looking at and see if, even if your exact problem isn't known, maybe there's something close enough, it will help you get a good reduction. I will say that this whole issue of doing these reductions is not a trivial thing to do. So usually if someone has done one of these, you can follow relatively easily why it's a good reduction, but often a lot of creativity is needed to come up with these. It's not necessarily a trivial thing to take a new problem and find a reduction that works. People can spend quite a lot of effort trying to do that, but this is more or less how you would do it. All right, so the last thing I want to do, and we may not have time to finish this today, is to go through what I kind of think of as a guidebook of things you can do if you've ended up with a hard problem. So as I mentioned, quite a lot when we're doing modeling of real-world problems, natural sorts of models will end up being intractable problems. And so I think it's important to have a set of techniques you can use. You can't just necessarily look at your problem and just give up on it as soon as you realize it's intractable. Lots of times we really do need to deal with intractable problems. So I give a kind of general set of guidelines, what to do with hard problems. So the first thing I would usually recommend when dealing with a hard problem is make sure it's really hard. This may seem like a kind of obvious thing to say, but as I tried to convey earlier in the class, very often quite subtle changes in the definition of a problem can affect whether or not it's hard. And very often in a real-world situation, we might be dealing with a problem that looks hard, but we're dealing with a special case of inputs. So if you don't have every possible input, it may be that the problem is not hard on the subset of inputs you're dealing with. So an example of that would be in a graph problem, I mentioned planar graphs. Lots of hard graph problems are actually tractable if you know your input is a planar graph. The same thing might be true for a bounded degree graph, so a graph in which none of the nodes has more than a certain number of neighbors. There's some specialized kinds of graphs that come up quite a bit in biology contexts, such as what are called chordal or overlap graphs. Those have important uses in genomics. Many problems that are hard on general graphs won't be hard if you know that your input graph is what's called chordal or overlap or various other kinds of things. For string problems, it may be that a problem that's hard on arbitrary strings is not hard on strings of bounded length. So it might be that it's hard if you allow the strings to have any length, but for any fixed length k of strings, it's not hard. Or maybe a fixed number of strings, or fixed alphabet size, or whatever, or possibly an arbitrary alphabet size. So a problem may be hard if the alphabet is restricted to k characters, not hard if you're allowed to have an arbitrary number of characters. There are a lot of kinds of problems that we'll deal with that involve some kind of error correction. Almost always, an error correction problem is not hard if you have a bounded number of errors. So if you're trying to deal with some kind of sequence alignment problem, well, sequence alignment maybe isn't the best example, it's some kind of assembly allowing for sequence errors. It may be hard if you have an arbitrary number of errors, not hard if you can say there are no more than k errors for some k. And any problem is going to be easy if the total input size is bounded. Not necessarily easy, but tractable. So it's not really meaningful to talk about an intractable problem if you never deal with instances of the problem that are more than a certain size. So very often, if you're not dealing with big problem instances, it really doesn't matter that the problem is intractable. It's not in a formal sense intractable. Is there any questions about that? Often a good next step when dealing with a hard problem, if you've really convinced yourself it is hard, is to just do what I call a brute force solution. So any hard problem you can solve by just trying every possible solution. So if you're trying a traveling salesman problem, try every possible path and see which is the shortest. If you're doing a minimum test set problem, try all of the subsets and see which is the smallest one that covers all of the elements of the set. That may sound like a silly thing to do, but if you're not dealing with large problem instances, this is often actually the best thing to do. It's usually pretty easy to code up a brute force algorithm, pretty easy to debug it, and for small instances, keeping things simple like that is often actually faster than trying to do something more complicated. So if you know you're not working with instances too big to deal with by brute force, it's actually often a fine thing to do. Now beyond that, you often have to get into more sophisticated kinds of options. So I wanted to mention some of your alternatives there. And one of the first ones that can be quite hard to deal with is what are called approximation algorithms. An approximation algorithm is an algorithm that doesn't necessarily solve your problem optimally, but gives you a fast solution that is pretty good by some measure. So a simple example of this that we can see is for the vertex cover problem. And the vertex cover, let me take an example of a vertex cover instance here. Let's say we've got the following graph. We're trying to find a vertex cover for it. Finding an optimal vertex cover is hard, so maybe this is a small enough instance. We could find it by brute force. But here, let's just pretend we can't do that. But it turns out there is a fast approximation algorithm that can get you within a constant factor of the best possible solution. And it works as follows. Take any edge, doesn't matter which one, and throw that into a matching on this graph. And you should remember from last time, a matching is just a set of edges that don't share any endpoints. So we'll throw that in, and then kind of throw away all the edges that share an endpoint with this edge. And then throw in another from the set that's left. So then you throw in this one, throw away all the edges that share an endpoint, throw in, let's say, this one, throw away the edges that share an endpoint, and then and more. So we've got now a matching in our graph. And then we will say our vertex cover is all of the vertices at the endpoints of this matching. In this case, it happens that that includes every vertex in the graph. Usually it's going to work out a little better than that. But what you can actually show is that whatever matching this gives you, or whatever vertex cover, it actually can't be more than twice as big as the best vertex cover in that graph. So the proof of that is well, I'll give it a bit informally. So suppose this were not a vertex cover. Well, we can show that that can't be true, because if we didn't have a vertex cover, that would mean there was some edge in the graph where we didn't have either endpoint in the matching, and that would have meant we could have thrown another edge into the matching, and since we keep going until we put in every possible edge we can, that would be impossible. We would not have what's called a maximal matching, so that's a contradiction. So we know we've got a vertex cover. Now, as for why it can't be more than twice as big as the largest one, the fact that we're working from a matching guarantees that. Because if we have a set of edges that don't share any endpoint, then we have to have at least one endpoint of each edge in the matching to have a vertex cover. Vertex cover has to have at least one point from each endpoint of each edge, so it has to have at least one endpoint of each edge in the matching. So the cost of the optimal vertex cover can't be smaller than the number of edges in the matching. Our vertex cover has a cost that's exactly twice the number of edges in the matching. So what we've proven here is that this is an algorithm that's guaranteed to give you within a factor of 2 of an optimal vertex cover. That's known as a 2 approximation. That would be a simple example of an approximation algorithm. So the references I told you about in the previous class, or excuse me, earlier in this lecture, where you can look up NP complete problems, will very often also have information on approximation algorithms known for those problems. And a lot of these well-studied problems, people have also done a lot of theory of looking into whether or not they have approximation algorithms, maybe looking into approximation algorithms for special cases. And just as small changes in the problem statement can make a difference between whether or not a problem is tractable, they can also make a difference into how approximable a problem is. So, for example, this is an instance of a problem that has a 2 approximation, and some problems have what we call an alpha approximation, which means that there is some constant factor, in this case alpha equals 2, and you can get an algorithm that is within that factor alpha. And sometimes you can do this for up to some best alpha and then no better than that. Not actually sure what it is for vertex cover, but some problems, for example, there are algorithms that can get you a 3/2 approximation. There's provably nothing that can do better than 3/2. Other problems have what is called an epsilon approximation scheme, which means that for any value of epsilon, there is an epsilon approximation algorithm. So you can find an algorithm that is a 2 approximation, you can find one that's a 1.5 or 1.1 or 1.001. And of course, there has to be a catch there. The catch would be that somehow or other the runtime of the approximation algorithm will blow up exponentially as you push epsilon smaller, but still for any fixed epsilon you can do it. And other problems have neither of those. There's some problems where there is no alpha, no fixed alpha, where you can develop an approximation algorithm. And it can often be minor variations on the same problem. So the general traveling salesman problem has no approximation algorithm. There's no constant factor where you can get an approximation. There's what's called the triangle or metric traveling salesman problem, which is the traveling salesman problem where we just throw in one extra constraint that the weight or the distance between any 2 nodes u and v can't be more than the weight from u to a third node t plus the weight from t to b. So in other words, if you have a triangle, the cost of going from here to here can't be more than the cost of going here to here. It's a very common situation in the real world. if you have that, then there are alpha approximations for some values of alpha, but there are limits on how good that can be. And there's an even specialer case, the Euclidean traveling salesman problem. So Euclidean traveling salesman problem just means that you have Euclidean distances. So like, let's say if I just drew a graph on the whiteboard here, or the blackboard, and the distance between nodes was literally the straight line distance between them, that's a Euclidean traveling salesman. That has an approximation scheme. So any the minor variations in the problem can often affect its approximability, so it's often worth looking into your problem carefully and seeing what's known about it if you want to go that route. So that basically is approximation algorithms, and you can take entire semester-long classes on approximation algorithms. There's a lot more to know about these, but I think you should at least be aware that they exist. So any questions about that? Okay, so we're not going to be able to finish this today. I think I'll try to get through one more point here, and that is if you really need an optimal algorithm, you really need to get the optimal solution, but brute force is too slow, very often what you will use is something called a branch and bound algorithm. So branch and bound is basically just brute force with a little more intelligence behind it. And we can visualize that by thinking of, let's say, a graph coloring problem. So imagine that we're trying to color some graph. In a branch and bound problem, we would try to do sort of a brute force search of possible solutions. Maybe try coloring this node, then this one, and so forth. But we try to do this in such a way that as we go through this, if we figure out that we've hit a dead end, that we can't get to a solution, we don't finish coloring the graph. We just stop there and back up. You can often represent that as a kind of search tree, where you can say if this is node V1, and that's V2, and that's V3. We can say at the top of our search tree, maybe we are coloring node V1, and we can color that 1, 2, or 3. At the next level, we're coloring node V2, we can color that 1, 2, or 3, and so forth. And sometimes we can just recognize immediately that this is a bad solution. You can't color V1, 1 and V2, 1, so we just stop there and we stop searching further. So that would be a pretty trivial branch and bound, but we can improve on that quite a bit in many cases with more sophisticated methods. So it might be that we can color part of the graph and then try to prove that there's no way to color the rest of it with less than a certain amount of colors. And actually, very often a way you can do that is with an approximation algorithm. So there is a 3/2 approximation for graph coloring. So you can try figuring out part of your search tree, running your 3/2 approximation on the rest of the graph, and then you know that the absolute best solution can't be better than 2/3 of whatever it costs your approximation algorithm here. So you can say the best solution that starts with this coloring can't be better than the cost of this coloring plus 2/3 of the fast solution to this one. And if that's worse than the best solution you already know about, then you know you've hit a dead end. You don't need to go any further here, so you can back up in your search tree. So that's the basic idea behind the branch and bound method. And very often that can get you something that will guarantee you an optimal solution, but do it much faster in practice than a brute force method. All right, so any questions about that? Okay, so we're out of time today, so I guess we'll finish this next time. And then we'll get to our next lecture, which will be a case study of how some of these issues come up in the context of sequence assembly.